Okay, the volume okay? The sound good? Excellent, thank you. And good morning. It's very nice to see all of you. I taught this course for the first time last winter, and I learned a great deal more than any of the participants, and so I said, well, let's do it again. Maybe there's more. I am a philosopher by training and by temperament, which means that if you want to argue with me, if you have disagreements, that's a great sign. One, it means you were listening, and second, it means that I'm likely to learn something. I know what I'm going to say. What I don't know is what your response is likely to be. The other thing to know about these talks is that these are not lectures in some usual sense in which you progress A, B, C, D in a kind of orderly fashion. It's more like a jazz composition. We're going to be hitting notes, playing themes, and skipping around. So we may go from A to D and then back to B, play a little variation on B, see what you think about it, and then develop it a little further. So I don't want you to think that somehow, at the end of each session, we're going to build on that and come to the next session. And a few times we will do that. But most of the time, it's like probing in greater depth and with some variation, some of the major themes that I'm going to introduce today. So that's another way of saying that anything said in any of the sessions is fair game for conversation all the way through the 6 sessions. The other thing that I have to say as a disclaimer is that, I don't have any special expertise in end of life. I spent more than 40 years teaching medical students, graduate students, and undergraduates in courses about end of life care, ethical problems in end of life. I've been part of a hospital consult service in which we were called to respond when there were individual patient care difficulties, usually clinicians and families disagreeing about end of life. I've suffered the loss of both of my parents and a good number of my friends. Some of those have been enormously joyous and celebratory. Others have been plagued by a range of problems. That's probably true for you as well. But this is a way of saying, I don't know any more than you do. And we're just exploring this together. That's my feel of it. It's a way of trying to have a conversation in which we pool each other's knowledge, and hopefully I'll say some things which will stimulate you to some new thoughts, and you will do the same for me. So that's my ambition for these 6 sessions. One of the things to say in the beginning is that there are differences between problems and mysteries. This is a distinction I'm borrowing from Gabriel Marcel, who was a mid-20th century French existentialist theologian. He said, problems have solutions. You can work on them logically. You can put out your best analytical efforts and try to come to, if not a solution, then a resolution. But mysteries are just things that people have to live with. And part of dying and part of death is a problem, or a series of problems that we can work on jointly. But parts of this are just mysteries that we have to learn to live with. And what Marcel said is that if you try to put your intellectual, analytical skills to work on mysteries, you're always going to be frustrated. So this is just a signal pointer for some thematics I'm going to try to develop during the course of the 6 weeks. You'll notice I put my email on the first slide. I'd love to hear from you. If you have comments, questions, suggestions, just write me. I'll probably get back to you in a day or two. But this is the way I can sense, what's going on in the course? What are people thinking about? And what do we need to work more on? I also want to try to reserve the last session for more of your input into what haven't we talked about that we really need to talk about in your view. This is where we're going. Session 1 today, major themes introduce the difficult quest for a good death. Session 2, probing the American sensibility, what we fear and what we yearn for. There's a good deal of information from studies that have been done about what do people really have a great fear of and what do they want, what do they yearn for, what do they find is missing. We have to spend some time on advanced care planning documents, advanced directives. How many of you have such documents? Yeah, almost everybody. Well, for session 3, bring it along. Okay? We're going to look at what it says, the kind of things that are implied in it, what we can expect, and so it's entitled Realistic Expectations and Magical Thinking. Session 4, Physician Assistance in Death, an ethical review of policies and practices. This is, as you know, a growing phenomenon. Many states and some other countries, Canada among them most recently, have provisions for physicians assisting terminally ill patients into their death. And I think it's good to spend some time thinking about that. And what are the ins and outs of it, the assets and liabilities of it. Session 5, finitude, virtues, and the question of a duty to die. What in the world could that be? Is there such a thing as a duty to die? Can you imagine that you would have an obligation, in fact, to end your life? Some people do. It's been discussed an awful lot in the literature, and I think it's a very interesting topic. Under what conditions people would feel such an obligation. And is it really an obligation or is it something else? And finally, what I've labeled responses, nagging issues, and other leftovers. There will be a lot of that, actually. So I want to reserve most of that session to dealing with those leftovers. Michel de Montaigne, the father of the essay, wrote this, 1595. If you don't know how to die, don't worry. Nature will tell you what to do on the spot fully and adequately. She will do this job perfectly for you, so don't bother your head about it. Well, lucky for him, right? No EMTs, no ICUs, right? No living wills, no durable powers to protect us against overzealous providers or guilt-ridden families. But maybe there's still some truth in that, and that's why I wanted to put this up here in the beginning and put it on the back of your mind. Because most of us do have some kind of notion of nature working in our sensibility. What's natural and what isn't. For some people, this is written into their durable powers of attorney and their living wills. In fact, some of these are called natural death acts. So what is your working notion of nature? Another question to put out that we can play with as we move along. And some more motifs to keep in mind. All philosophy is training for death. What does that mean? And by philosophy, I just mean, reflective capacities. You're probably familiar with Psalm 90, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Teaching people to die is teaching them to live. This is not only Montaigne, this is a great motif of ancient Stoicism. People like Cicero and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and a whole range of other people who were very influential in the classical period Teaching people to die is to teach them to live. And finally, Wendell Berry. Any definition of health that does not include death is silly. Not just wrong, but silly. Meaning sort of immature, really. Now notice he's saying not a definition of life, but a definition of health. A definition of what it means to lead a healthy life. Has to include some notion of death within it. Okay, these are just, as I say, little tidbits to kind of think about. By the way, I'm putting all the slides up. I'll send them in to the Ollie folks, and they'll put them online if you want to come back and look at them. So it's been long said of our American culture that we are death-denying. So the British historian Arnold Toynbee, death is un-American. Death is an option. It's an accident or the result of a preventable illness. Aging seen as a problem for science. Isn't it interesting that a lot of the scions of high tech have been investing their money into anti-aging programs? I'm not sure what that tells us, but it's just quite interesting. I've also watched many congressional hearings that have to do with advances that are supposed to be anti-aging, and the eagerness with which late middle-aged congressmen were lapping up this news. So I think the death denial motif is alive and well for us. A part of this may be the medicalization of dying. Philip R.E. is a historian, and I'll come back to him in one of the future sessions, talked about the fact that death and the dying process are really not things that we're privy to. Most of us didn't, like our grandparents, grow up on a farm where you see animals die all the time. You can be an entering medical student in this country and never have seen a dead body. So there's a remove, a professional handling, right? In the latter stages, it's the mortician, but in the early stages, it's the medical profession and the nursing profession and others who manage this for us. This is less true than it used to be, thank goodness. But still, I think, a very prominent motif in our society. And terms like died and death in condolence letters are a no-no. Now, I haven't looked at Amy Vanderbilt's complete book of etiquette recently, but I can tell you that at least late in the 20th century, that was still there. The recommended condolence letter says, don't use words like that. That's much too harsh. You should talk about, people passing. So died and death sound too harsh for polite company. I think that's still true, not as much perhaps as it used to be. So here's some euphemisms I collected. To be in Abraham's bosom, to make the big jump, to pop off the hooks, to do one's bit, to buy the farm, to go home in a box, to check out, to cash in one's chips, to go up the creek or up the Salt River, and so on. Strike out, a baseball metaphor, I suppose, and to be trumped, which doesn't mean now what it used to mean as a bridge metaphor. But this is an indication, I think, of the ways in which one can avoid the kind of brutal harshness of saying died or dead. It's interesting, in Ney and Silverman's book of euphemisms, isn't this a lovely title, Kind Words, right? There are more terms for the end of life than for anything except what? Sexual acts, right. That leads the list still. Okay, the consequences of this, if in fact you buy this thesis that we still have a lot to get over about death and dying, and this is not my list, it's just a compilation of things people have said and written books about. Funeral practices that mask death. Theological doctrines that deny death or portray it as, quote, the enemy of God. In my view, quoting St. Paul out of context, but that's a whole other story. Medical practices that abandon the dying. I've had several friends die, and in almost all cases, all but one I can remember, the oncologist, nothing against oncologists, I think it's a professional hazard, stop communicating with the patient when the therapies are no longer working. This has happened over and over. And there's a transfer, okay, frequently, but one of the things that seems important to people is that the people that they have struggled with and had intimate contact with professionally continue in some kind of relationship with them and not simply abandon them. But I think this is a too frequent practice. As I mentioned earlier, researches and technologies that seek to arrest aging and therefore postpone dying. Social practices that don't tolerate grief. Okay, you probably know this, but most people don't. If you have a significant death, what is the average grieving time?
2 weeks, a week.
Well, a week or 2 weeks is what we think people should, begin to get back into the swing of things.
7 months.
18 months. 18 months is the average grieving time for a significant loss, meaning a member of your family. Of course, you never get over the death of a child, but the death of a spouse, maybe the death of a parent that you're particularly close to, a brother or sister, 18 months. Now, I'm not suggesting that people take 18 months off of work. I'm just saying that the grieving process has its own rhythm and its own time. Yes, sir?
Could you define grieving? Because for me, it's forever.
Yes. The point in time in which you begin to grasp onto life again with some degree of positivity and adjustment. That's what we mean by the end of a grieving cycle. So that you can talk about the loss without crying, or you can function adequately in your social roles or in your job, perhaps. Okay. And the politicization of private decisions. I'm thinking here primarily of the Terry Schiavo case, which I spent a lot of time working on, in which, who? Everybody was in on that. Both the Bushes, who held political office at that time, the news media. It was quite an amazing phenomenon. So you wonder, Terry Schiavo's husband and her parents, what are they to make of all this? It's like her death belonged to everybody. We all had a stake in it. But to have a stake in it politically is, I think, an error of a greater kind. So here's some examples of the thesis that I've been talking about. Anybody ever read Jessica Mitford, The American Way of Death? Came out in 1963. The Mitford sisters were something else. You ought to go look up the Mitford sisters, of which Jessica was one. At a very early age, she was saving money so she could run away from home. 2 of her sisters, there were 5 of them, married Nazi sympathizers. One of them spent time in jail. I mean, they were an unusual group of people. And Jessica was one of the people who was very good at writing, and this book actually reached the very top of the bestseller list during the mid-60s. In fact, it was so popular. Well, let me tell you what it was, in case you haven't read it. It's about the greed of the mortician industry and about the expensiveness of it and about the aesthetic qualities that are aimed for in terms of the presentation of the dead body. And she got a lot of regulations passed, not she, but the impact she had. But it's still not much different. So here I am 7 years ago with my father, who has just died after a long and really terrific life. He's 93. We're at the funeral home, and we're trying to figure out, what to do in terms of all the kind of arrangements for burial and the caskets and so on. So we looked at all the caskets, even the one which was, a biodegradable kind of shell. They were all $10,000. So it didn't matter, really, whether you got a fancy one or a plain one or one that was just, biodegradable. It's all the same price. It's great. This was made along with another book called The Loved One into a movie. Did anybody ever see the movie called The Loved One? Oh, this is worth watching. It came out in 1965. It's largely based on Mitford's book. The mortuary service is called Whispering Glade, and Liberace plays the part of the casket salesman. The owner of the establishment actually is a minister who's played by Jonathan Winters. You can see this is a comedy, right? A dark comedy. And Rod Steiger plays the chief embalmer. His name was Mr. Joyboy. And one of the things they would sell you is a kind of package which would shoot the casket off into space to orbit the Earth. That was the grand deluxe package, right? Well, anyway. The movie is called The Loved One. And here's just an illustration of the politicalization of private decisions. Can you read this in the back? Okay. Excuse me, I'm a public official. It says, news item, trend of politicians overruling medical decisions in end-of-life and abortion situations continues unchecked. Okay. All right. Now, if we are a culture which is marked to some degree by denial, as I am claiming, then it leads to, in part, a kind of polarization of views. And this is meant to outline what those views might look like, and sometimes do. A vitalism says life at all costs and in all forms is the most important thing. There is a sacredness of biological life, even if it has no consciousness. Death is the greatest evil, and health professionals are portrayed as saviors because they can pluck us from the jaws of death. Nihilism, the flip side of that, we can dispense and should dispense with life when it is burdensome or costly. There's a sacredness of individual choice. Suffering or loss of meaning is the greatest evil. And health professionals can also be seen as saviors if they're willing to help us be ushered out of this life in the way in which we want, right? Okay, so these are extreme portraits. I don't suspect that many of you are all the way up and down the line for each of these. I'm certainly not. But there are ways of understanding some of the movements in our culture and some of the thematics in terms of what is valued. The current trends, as I understand it, and this is just a partial list, I really would like for you to add what you know about some of these things. The expansion of hospice care has probably been, in my view, One of the most important things that has happened both for the medical profession but also for American culture in terms of our ability to understand and participate in a meaningful way in death. So I think that's a great plus. Some of the other ones may or may not be. Death doulas. People know about death doulas? They are guardians. It's hard to say guardians. They are that too, but they are essentially guides to help people through the difficult process of dying and help the family as well. Like birth doulas, these are death doulas, right? I have a former student who is a death doula in Los Angeles, and she holds frequently what she calls living funerals. These are events in which, before the ill person dies, the family and friends gather round and give what is essentially the eulogy. So the person who's dying gets to hear it, right? Instead of all those nice things we say about people after they've died, this is the way a person can, in a sense, participate. Now, I don't know what that means, actually, for the post-mortem care and all the rest. I suppose something also happens there, but this is supposed to be the time in which there is a gathering and a saying of significance in the presence of the person who is dying. There are death cafes where people get together and talk about death. Death over dinner, which I thought was probably some kind of mystery tale in which somebody got killed during the entree. No, this is meeting for a meal in which the express purpose is to talk about death, what you want, what you're afraid of, what you hope will happen, and so on. So these are all kind of movements in the last 4 or 5 years. There's lots of stuff on YouTube about this, people giving TED Talks about death cafes and death over dinner. So there's a wealth of information out there about people who are trying to do this a little bit differently. Death cleaning. This was a new one to me. And so you're supposed to be cleaning out your possessions and asking this question: will anybody I know be happier if I save this? You're supposed to be cleansing for your survivors, right? I think this is actually a pretty good idea. And there are, of course, a variety of green burials with custom biodegradable shrouds that you can purchase. Now, is this a healthy trend? Well, maybe it is, or this is just another way of kind of covering over our anxiety. Maybe. Is this something that can make our fear of death less, or is it something that can make a death experience more meaningful? So remember, our subtitle is The Quest, I added the difficult, the frustrating quest for a meaningful death. For a lot of us, we would translate that into a good death as opposed to a bad death. So you thought I was kidding and I was just going to jump around and hit a bunch of themes. No, that's really what I'm going to do. But we're going to probe each of them a little more deeply as we go through this. Dimensions of a good death. A lot of people have studied this. A lot of very smart social scientists have interviewed people over the last, 3 or 4 decades at least. And they all seem to come up with roughly the same thing. A good death is when I can avoid social death, that is abandonment, being left alone to die. When I can minimize pain and suffering. When biological and biographical death occur simultaneously or near simultaneously. What do I mean by that? Well, biological death is the death of your body. It's biology. right? It's when it stops working, the heart stops, and so on. Biographical death is the you that we each identify with as being essentially who we are as an individual, our person. We each have a biography, a unique biography. Just like the uniqueness of our biology, we have a biography that is really us in terms of all the particulars that make us who we understand ourselves to be and who we appreciate in other people as we understand their individuality. So when biographical death precedes biological death, your biography is gone, but your biology is still hanging around, right? This is the explication of permanent unconsciousness or of severe cases of Alzheimer's or traumatic brain injuries in which the person no longer has a sense of self. Of course, in Alzheimer's, the great tragedy is that sometimes people become other selves, which is why Alzheimer's is usually listed at the very top of the list of deaths I don't want. But a good death is usually one characterized by these things. Social or community supports, not abandonment. Not a social death, right? The absence of pain and suffering, or to the extent that that can be possible, and the biography and the biology exit at the same time. Okay? Or another way to put this, when people are given a little more time to think about this, they will talk about a death which reflects their life, presumably the higher values of their life, the sense that they identify with in terms of their best selves, right? Okay. Dying in a way that reflects and affirms the values of one's life. Yes, sir?
You left two things that I was wondering why they weren't on there. Dying with dignity and dying with the least hurt on the people around you.
That's great. Well, you know, further down the list, those things are mentioned. And death with dignity is usually talked about as a, quote, natural death. That's why the whole business about what's natural and what isn't is an important one for our considerations. Yes, you're right. I mean, almost everybody I've talked to says, I don't want to be a burden, or I don't want to put undue stress on the survivors. And one definition of a good death is one in which, in fact, your survivors, in a sense, almost welcome your death because they see it as timely for you. More about that later. I don't know what that means. We'll move ahead. So let me try to illustrate this in terms of this wonderful poem by Rilke, Having Death Reflect One's Life. This is one of his prayer poems. O God, grant each of us his death, indeed the dying, which out of that same life evolves, in which he once had meaning, love, and need. The death of one's own, a death that is distinctively one's own.
When did he write that?
Oh, you're going to tax me now. I don't know.
More than 50 years ago?
Yes, I think almost certainly. Yes.
Because he leaves out all the gizmos, the ventilators, the IVs, all that stuff.
That's right. And that's why this is so challenging for us, actually, is that there are people out there poised. Their whole professional identity is poised, in fact, to keep us from dying. Not everybody, but, you know, often enough the case. Another thing I want to emphasize is, and this is your point, thank you for introducing it, the precarious nature of dying well This is an extremely old quote. Ovid, quoted by many, many people, and this is the version from Montaigne's Essays. Call no man happy until his death. Always we must await his final day, reserving judgment till he's laid away. What did he have in mind here? Life is suffering, and you may end up, you may have an absolutely wonderful life and end up in an ignominious death scenario in which all that was about you is subsumed under the fact of the way you died. I have a death like this in my family. You may as well. In which it was the last part of the life which really subsumed all the goodness and meaning and richness that had preceded that. This is an uncle for me who spent 10 years being fed in a persistent vegetative state at the insistence of one of his daughters. When everybody else said, well, we're done, she said, no. Well, okay. It's legal just about everywhere. Legal just about everywhere, yeah. And when we get to the whole business about living wills and advance directives, we'll look at the way the Tennessee legislature has seen fit to handle that particular question of tube feeding. Now, another motif I want to strike here, as I already have, is that death is natural, or could be seen as natural. Jack McHugh was, for a little bit, one of my colleagues at UNC, and this is an absolutely brilliant article, I think. He said it's natural, it's expected, it's the kind of things that happens to our species, and we just need to pay attention to that and try not to resist it too hard. He focused on the very elderly who he said frequently lost a will to live. He was fascinated by the fact that the elderly would die without any particular cause of death being identified. So he really believes in the notion of a will to live, a will to sustain yourself. Does the idea that death might be natural somehow give it more meaning, or a kind of meaning that we want? Does the naturalness of death, if we can stop and reflect on it, reassure us in some ways? Is it a prophylactic against fear? Just a motif we can worry about. Dying is also spiritual. It's an opportunity for affirming our finitude, a blessing, an opening of possibilities for spiritual meaning. Hans Jonas was a survivor of the Holocaust, really an important philosopher in the 20th century. And this is his classic article, The Burdens and Blessings of Mortality. I want to give you a little bit of an introduction about my understanding about spirituality. Because I don't mean religious or theological convictions, necessarily. This is taken from Abraham Maslow, a psychologist, who studied what he called peak experiences, experiences of a sense of transcendence that he thought all human beings have, and maybe some of the great apes also. He said there is a sense in a spiritual experience of being in touch with what's real as opposed to what's transient, what's lasting, what's eternal. Something that you would want to call sacred rather than profane. There's also, he said, a sense of the goodness, beauty, and wholeness of things. And a sense that you belong. You have a sense that you belong to this encompassing wholeness. And there's also frequently a tremendous sense of beauty and reassurance about this. And the response is awe, wonder, reverence. So he wasn't talking necessarily about a specific religiously sponsored experience. He was talking about what happens to people sometimes when they're hiking in Yellowstone. Or maybe the first time they hold one of their grandchildren. This certainly happened to me. My first grandchild, I was holding him in the nursery, and I said, what came upon me was, it's okay for me to die now. It's all right. I wasn't ready to die, right? No. But it would be okay. There was a sense that this is working. This is the way it should be. And I belong to something, bigger. You've all had this. It's just a question of where you have it. Whether nature brings this or whether it's an intimate conversation with a friend. It could be anything. Human spirituality may or may not take a traditional religious form. For many people it does, and for other people it doesn't. Humans are polymorphously spiritual. What I mean by this is that there are a very wide range, perhaps a limitless number of human experiences or activities that can serve as a conduit to an experience of spirituality, of holiness, of the sacred. For some people, it can be sex. This is a big part of Tantrism. For other people, it can be praying, it can be meditating, it can be eating, it can be conversing, it can be praying, it can be meditating. There's probably no activity within the human sphere which hasn't been tapped upon as an avenue into a kind of a spiritual experience. And that's what I want to emphasize here. Being open to this broad range of possibilities of the human, which I'm just going to call spiritual, for lack of a better word. Yes, sir?
I'm sure you know it, but I just finished a very sort of short and nice book called Life After Life, which really gets at the topic of this slide and the prior one.
I haven't read that. I don't think. Who's the author?
Raymond Moody.
Raymond Moody. Okay, I'm familiar with it. I honestly haven't read it. I want to spend a little time later on talking about what you make of so-called, after-death experiences. Big tunnels, bright lights, this kind of thing. Yeah, what are we supposed to make of that? But anyway, my only point here is that dying, being one of the most profoundly important things that each of us will ever do, is a very rich ground, no pun intended, for spirituality. This is where spirituality can blossom, independent of any beliefs one might have about an afterlife or, what's in store for one. Could someone tell me the time? How are we doing?
12:04.
12:04. Oh, that's not good. Okay. I'm going to skip this over, but this is just the idea that caring for the dying is a spiritual activity regardless of theological convictions, because it taps into that deep level of meaning, that layer of significance. Wouldn't you like to be as happy as this guy is? This is Gabriel Marcel, who I mentioned earlier. The mystery of being. And here's something I want to put forward. Dying is a natural event. This is Jack McHugh, right? Things that obscure this or prevent this fit Marcel's notion of a problem. Dying is spiritual, or having spiritual possibilities. The human experiences of this kind fit Marcel's notion of a mystery. We'll come back to all this. Yeah. You know what? Yeah, let me tell you a little bit more about this. This is my rough typology of the way people feel about medical interventions when one is critically ill. 3 categorizations. Fearful minimalists, and I'm going to read to you just a bit because I've written a lot about this. The fearful minimalists are the group that want to take the first train out of this life and do so with the least amount of expense and fuss possible. Sometimes these persons are motivated by noble things like saving resources for the grandchildren or sparing their relations the pain and disruption of caring for them over a long demise. But always these persons are motivated by fear. They sign advance directives in droves. Living wills and durable powers of attorney are frequently in their possession and not simply in their lawyers' or doctors' offices. What they fear is what they take to be a fate worse than death, the demeaning and dehumanizing position of being tethered to some piece of supportive but not restorative technology. Enslaved by an imperative, by an institution reacting to fear of litigation or religious vitalistic dogma, and a cohort of professional helpers in a passive, self-protective posture, and perhaps a guilt and denial-ridden family in tow. The fearful minimalists see this rightly as an almost irresistible set of forces. If they are to have any chance at calling the shots for themselves, they must be well armed with legal documents and be willing to risk a premature death in order to avoid a lingering, expensive, painful, or vegetative one. Sound like you? Well, wait. At the other end of the pendulum spring are the hopeful vitalists. Okay, the hopeful vitalists. They are vitalists because they count any degree or quality of life as worthy of the candle. They see no injustice in spending whatever it takes to preserve their presence. To hell with the trade-offs, this is my life we're talking about, a phrase I have heard. They are hopeful vitalists because they have bought wholesale the propaganda of the health professions, the pharmaceutical firms, and the healthcare industry that breakthroughs happen routinely, and that a cure for my particular disease is just around the corner, that we are winning the war on cancer, Alzheimer's, and even aging. They are hopeful and not just optimistic, since they hold their views not because of, but in spite of, the evidence. If you are going to die, the ethical imperative is not to die too soon. Hopeful vitalists will elect to receive treatments that some of us would regard as heroic, inappropriately aggressive, painful, burdensome, or even a torturous flogging. There are more of us in this category than one might think. My colleague Marion Danis and I, she ran the ICUs at UNC, did surveys of patients who had just emerged from the ICU and asked them, would you be willing to go through that again for just one day of additional life? And the majority of people said yes. ICUs are no picnic. If you've ever been in one, you know. In the very large middle, where I place myself most of the time, are the anxious agnostics. These persons don't know exactly what they want until they get there. They are skeptical of both too little care at the end of life and too much. They simply want to die at an appropriate time, without too much expense and with minimal burdens on families and without too much pain, but they also don't want to go before they really have to, when they will be ready. And for the signal of that readiness, they depend fundamentally on their families, their friends, the clergy, and especially on their health care providers. They look to all these persons to confirm their hunches that it's getting to be close to time, or it's really not. And one of the things that makes the anxious agnostics the most anxious is the reports about how infrequently patients with really serious illnesses don't have the conversations with their healthcare provider about, where am I really? How long have I got? What should I be thinking about now? Right? Tell me the truth. Those conversations are difficult to have. We're having more of them now than we used to, but not still enough. My financial advisor said you always have to be keeping yourself away from two poles. One is greed, because you hope the market's going to go up, and it has been going up a little recently. And fear, meaning that you're going to sell all your holdings with the next downturn. And I think this is where the anxious agnostics are too. Greed about some more life, a little bit more, why not? And fear that in fact I will work to preserve myself, and others will too long. The idea that one has lived too long is an active notion for most of us. So we have to figure out, what does that really mean? Okay. I really want you to do this, not just read. Imagine your own death. How old are you? Is there a specific date? Where are you? What is the cause of your death? And do you have any last words? Now, for this to work, you'll need actually to write this down. Or at least certainly make a strong mental note. I've been asking people this for over 30 years, and when I ask undergraduates, medical and graduate students, they come up with comic scenes. And few of them can understand that it might be a natural thing, that in fact, you will grow old, weaker, and sick, and finally die. Most of them have their imagined deaths in automobile accidents. They have violent deaths. Unless they have some particular family history that turns them in a different direction. But that's not true for you. I know all of you have thought about this. How old will I be when I die? Do you have a specific date in mind for that? Where are you? What caused your death? And the last words business. How are we doing on time now?
You're 2 minutes from being 15 minutes away from the end.
Okay, perfect.
17 minutes.
Perfect. 17 minutes. I want to hear from you. How old are you when you die? Yes, sir.
Not on that slide, but on the prior.
Oh, no, not so fast. Okay, go ahead.
This is just to plant a seed for you, because I think you mentioned cancer, that you've known a bunch of people that have passed from cancer, and I think it's just so prevalent, it's everywhere.
Yes.
It's relevant to some of us, or to
Yes.
family members, or whatever. The decision by a cancer patient who is undergoing, let's say, treatment or has undergone a series of treatments, right?
Right.
And is still facing an unfortunate prognosis. The decision to say stop is a decision that I don't feel like is getting much support in how the heck you make that call.
From
If it's out there, I don't know where.
from healthcare professionals or from the society?
From anybody.
It's an excellent point. And hold that, because
Anything in a later
yes,
to say
good,
about that would be cool.
good. The time when you say this is enough.
It's almost like your prior slide, the three people,
Yeah.
the optimist, the agnostic. I mean,
Yep.
you almost have to kind of, those all play in your crazy thinking about that choice.
Indeed they do. Okay, I want to come back to my question, which is, how old are you when you died? How many of you were, for example, over 85? Yeah. Anybody over 90? Great. All right. Okay. All right. I'm sorry? Yes. Well, maybe somebody made it to 95. I'm just seeing how far up we go. Okay.
There are life tables.
There are life tables. What do the life tables tell us?
I'll be dead at 83 or 84.
Yeah.
That's my expected.
Okay. Is that what figures into your imagination of your death? Yep. I'm going to be right on average?
I'm a statistician.
Okay. Oh, all right. Numbers have a reality for you they don't for most of us. Yes. Yes.
I kind of following when my mother and grandmother died in their 90s.
Right.
And I kind of got along with them so far.
Mhm.
Things have happened, you know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody have a specific date?
I chose today. I'm not suicidal.
But, yeah.
Thought I would do it.
Why not?
But I didn't hear.
Today.
Today. Today. Anybody? Yes, sir. What about? What if you don't count well in your head? I don't have a solution for that problem. Yeah. And,
My mother was the second oldest of 10 children,
yes.
and she took care of 8. And she had taught me you cry when a baby is born, and you rejoice when a person passes away. So I asked her for permission if she left this world before I did, to not have seen her funeral. And she said she wasn't ready to go yet. It just tickled me, but that wasn't perfect.
Yeah, stop jumping the gun there. You, yeah. So, right. Anybody die on their birthday? In your imagination. We're working on ourselves here. Yeah. Anybody, maybe you died on your wedding anniversary. Maybe you died on Christmas Day. Maybe you, I mean, sometimes people have particular notions about the appropriateness of when it would happen.
I wondered if you would repeat what he was saying, some of us couldn't hear.
Yes, would you repeat that? Yeah, stand up, right.
I said that my mother was the oldest of, second oldest of 10 children. She raised 8 of her mother's children. And I asked her for permission, but she had taught me, you know, you cry when a baby's born, and you rejoice when a person passed away. And so I asked her, I said, Mother, if you leave this world before I do, I would like permission not to attend your funeral. And she said, Gregory, I'm not ready to go yet. I got thinking about that because it was the love, how I've been loved. I've been told that I've been loved too much. But she was a homemaker too. And so when my father told me about the red rose when your mother is alive and a white rose when she passes away, I don't want to deal with no white rose. And today I'm not happy because before she passed away, 3 days before she passed away, she said, Gregory, are you ready for me to go? I said, Mom, you know I don't think that way. I wish you were with me always. And today, I can't tell that my mother is not with me. That she's gone. I can't tell because she's always with me.
Yeah.
And added to that, I had got, not bragging, but I got 6 letters from the Queen of England. And when I got the 4th letter, someone reminded me that getting a letter from the Queen of England is like the presence of my kingdom. So I combined that with my mother's last word. So I can't tell she's gone.
Thank you very much. Anybody have a location where they died? At home? You died at home? Yeah. All right. How many of you died at home? Yeah. Good for you. Yeah. Good. You want to be out there somewhere. Right. Yes, sir.
I live in Henry Manor.
Would you stand, please? Sorry.
It's a retirement village,
Yes.
and new people who come in are asked the question by current
Mm-hmm.
residents, why did you come here? And often they would say, I want die at home. And the people said, we've made this our home. I mean, the ones,
Right, right.
this is our home.
Can you hear on this side? Yes, good.
So I encourage you, or to those who are coming in, make this your home, rather than
Right.
make this a foreign place.
Thank you for that comment. Anybody die in a hospital? No? Yeah, you did.
That's what usually happens.
That's what usually happens. So what percentage of us will die either in a hospital or some kind of extended care health facility? Okay, I grant you that they are. But I'm still asking the question, rather than at home or in some home one has been welcomed into and adopted, how many Americans these days die either in a hospital or some kind of health care facility where they are cared for, supervised by nurse charges and all the rest?
75, 90.
Yeah, it's in the 80s. I'll have to look at the most recent numbers. And it has gone down just a little because of hospice. But you're right, there is a difference between dying in, let's say, a custodial care institution and in a hospital. And I assume you are suggesting that, in fact, the hospital is the worst place. No?
It can be. Either one can be pretty bad. What I'm suggesting is that if you don't see it coming, or if it happens to you in a nursing home and the nursing home's not prepared for it, you're going to end up in a hospital. I mean,
Thank you for that. You're going to end up in a hospital unless you're very careful. They're likely to ship you off in an EMT vehicle to the emergency room. You have to work for that not to happen. That's exactly correct, and I thank you for that observation. Let's keep going down the list. Cause of death? Old age. Old age. Well, what did they put on the birth certificate? I'm sorry, the death certificate. It's a Freudian slip. What do they put on your death certificate? Natural causes. Old age. Failure to thrive. Something like that. No, they're going to put something like heart attack or stroke, cerebrovascular accident, or kidney failure or cancer. They're not going to let you get away, very likely, with something like old age or just wore out, right?
Ready to go.
So there are better and worse ways to die, right? And did anybody die of Alzheimer's? Late stage Alzheimer's? Yeah, yeah. Is that in anybody's imagination now? No, I didn't think so. Yes, sir. It's in my imagination as a point of fear, but not one when I'm thinking about, the death I might kind of like, which is, has gone up and up. The longer I've done this, the more I've noticed the age has creeped up for me. But yeah, it was on my birthday after a big party. We've got 5 minutes left. Anybody have any last words? Yes, ma'am.
So, I imagine I'd be with my family somehow.
Stand up now and
my
face the
last
audience.
words would be, thank you, I'm sorry, it's been a gift and a privilege, I love you, and it's time for the big goodbye.
That's a lot. That's good. It's good. You were actually doing pretty well. Yes, sir. Did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did, and I'd like to share something with everyone. I've never been faced with having these questions asked of me. But when I was 65 years old, I had a birthday party, and I said to the group, I'm going to have a birthday party every 5 years. This is a frame of mind that I'm talking about. I'm going to have a birthday party every 5 years. years until there is no one left to come.
That's great. That's great. Well, I like the, continual stretching out that's implied in that scenario. Very good. Okay, any other comments? Yes, ma'am.
Last words, I told you I was sick.
Good. I think the funniest one I have ever seen was in a New Yorker cartoon. It's a picture of a tombstone, and what's inscribed on it is, "Never sick a day in his life, and now this." Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to die the day I could no longer take care of myself. It could be for any reason, maybe or whatever. So I wouldn't have the last minute.
Okay, fair enough. There's probably a little too much emphasis on last words, and a lot of people in the throes of death can't speak. So maybe we should rethink this whole thing about the famousness of last words and the importance. And especially is, as likely to be the case for most of us, we won't be exactly in our best mind in any case. So maybe the last words need to come earlier. Maybe it's like the living funeral. Okay, we're almost out. Yes, sir.
For me, it's not what to say, but what not to say. Don't say it because you're dead. That's your last words. You want to be a little careful.
Can you hear that? You got to be careful. It's not what you say, but what you don't say that's important.
I say you got to be careful what you not to say the wrong thing.
The wrong thing.
Because if you don't say anything at all, it's fine. But
That's great. What might be an example of the wrong thing to say on one's deathbed? It's all your fault, yes?
it's been 50 years and I never loved you.
All right. Oh,
I'm sorry I never got even with you.
yeah. Fair enough. All right, our time is out. I thank you and look forward to next week.